Hello Joe, welcome to another GameMaker tutorial. My name is Alex. Let's get creating. Alright, so in this video, I'm going to be showing you how we can create a fake 3 dimensions in 2 dimensions using collision layers, and how we can set up a very neat organized system that will allow us to toggle between these layers whenever we want and to create this look here on this screen. So I'm going to show you this project. I have one other example, and then we're going to get into how to create everything. So just to demonstrate what I mean by this, let's take a look at this project. And here you can see I have this little player moving around, pretty straightforward, and I have collisions defined for the player to follow. Okay, so I can't go off the bridge, I can't walk through walls, but if I come over here now, I can come down this staircase, and now that I'm in the water, when I come back over here, not only am I under the bridge, the collisions aren't the same, I actually can't even go this way, and I've now opened myself up, the player, to this whole new world of exploration and movement that wasn't available before. And now I can come back over here, I'm back on the land, I come up again through here, and I can't go into the water. We can even go explore over here some more. And again, I was able to go under the bridge, and now let's go up here, and now I go over the bridge, and I can't step off of it. So this is a really easy and simple, straightforward way to kind of create this illusion of 3 dimensions using collision layers. So we're going to jumping into that in just a second. I'm going to go ahead and show off one more example of how you can use this technique in implementation. This example I'm going to be showing you is from the GameMaker's Toolkit Game Jam of 2019 that I just did with a couple friends. And I'm just going to kind of demonstrate real quick how I use the same technique to create a very cool effect. So in this game, the theme was only one, and you basically just have to race to get to the bathroom and only have one. But one thing that I wanted to do is I wanted to add the ability for the physics objects that exist in the world to kind of be compartmentalized to the bathroom and then the real world. So in a second, once turbulence hits and you're on the toilet, you'll see that crap starts flying everywhere. Real mature humor, Alex, I know. But I'll demonstrate what this effect looks like in just a second. Okay, so here you can see that a bunch of physics objects have been created up in this room that we have. And when I get up, they fall through the door, and now they're in this airplane. So, and then if I go back into the bathroom, well, it looks like everything fell out, and there are some bugs here. But what happens is it allows us to, by setting up these collision layers that I did, it allows these objects to transfer from one room, quote unquote, to the other, even though this is all taking place in one GameMaker room. So the way this is happening is there's just different collisions on different layers, and as the player transitions from the bathroom to the airplane, we toggle on these collisions, and that allows the physics objects, to move around in the world and behave differently. And so that's just another application of this feature and how you can use it in your game. That's kind of a little bit more of an abstract implementation and was a little more complicated to implement. But for this example here that we're going to be going over in this tutorial, I think it's a little more straightforward and makes a little bit more sense. Okay, cool. Let's close it. Let's get started. Now I am going to be working off of this base level project, so if you don't have something to work off of, I recommend you check out another YouTube tutorial and get yourself just a basic top-down RPG style game with basic top-down movement. The art assets that I'm using in this video I will link to in the description down below. It is an asset pack on itch that you can purchase for $5. Okay, so the first thing that we need to take a look at is our room setup here. So we're just going to quickly go over all of the layers that I have set up preemptively, explain what they do, and then we will get started with some programming. So controllers, instances, and background are pretty common to a lot of projects we worked on before, so I'm not going to cover them. The only thing you need to know is on our controllers, we have an object called OBJGame, which is our game controller. And on our instances layer, we have OBJPlayer, which is obviously our player object. Background is just this blue color. And so the only other thing I really want to cover are these tile layers. Now, these tile layers are important because in this game, we are creating two game layers, so to speak. So what I mean by this is we have the player on the land, the top of the land when they're walking around up top, and then we have the player when they're in the water. Now, keep in mind that this area over here, this dock and this ladder is all part of this top land layer. So we're just going to call it the land, so to speak. And then everything else is this water. Now I named them land top, land bottom, because this doesn't necessarily have to be water per se. It can be anything. It could be lava. It could be more land. It could be grasslands. It could be, I don't know, whatever you want on this second bottom layer. And you can reproduce this concept over and over and over again to create as many different game layers as you want. But just know it is going to get a little more complex the more layers that you have. But for this demo, we're going to be showcasing just two, the top land area that you're going to walk on and the water. And the reason I chose water is just so it's very clear the distinction between when we're on one layer, the land, and when we're on the other layer, the water. So because of this, I have two layers called tiles land top, tiles land bottom. And if we take a look at tiles land top, this looks pretty straightforward. These are all the things that are going to be under the player when the player is on that top layer of the land. But then as we transition down into the bottom layer of the land, these are all the tiles that are going to be under the player when they're in the water. So if the player swims up to this wall, we still want the wall to fall behind the player in depth. And so that's why we have these separated off into this separate layer. Now this is going to make sense because we're going to start to create new layers in between these. And so that's going to make sense why we have these split off instead of just combining them into one. For now, we're starting with them just like this. But like I said, we will be creating new layers. So that's pretty much all we have for room setup. I recommend that you just take a moment, pause the video, and make sure that your project that you're working on is set up similarly because we're going to be building off of this moving forward. All right, so let's get jumping into some code. So what we need to do is we need to first kind of set up our collisions. So our player already has some code for movement and navigating through these collisions. I'm not going to be going over them, but we basically just have everything split up into two states, a move state and a swim state. And so they're going to be looking out for a collision object, and that's going to be determining where the player stops moving. So just to demonstrate this, let's go ahead and create our collision object. I'm going to call it solid, just because we used that name solid a lot in the past, and I'm going to make sure that, we were using obj solid for this project as well. So we've created an object called obj solid. I'm going to give it a sprite, and perfect. So now we have our obj solid. So the first thing that we should do is we should just come in here and create our collisions and place them where they need to be. So I'm going to create a new layer, and I'm going to just call this rename layer, and I'm going to call it collisions land. And for simplicity, let's just rename these. I'm going to rename these tile layers to tiles land and rename to tiles water, just to keep the distinction between land and water very clear. So we've created a new layer called collisions land, and let's go ahead and in here, we're going to come in and drag our collision object everywhere that we need it to be. So I'm going to resize our grid just to make it a little bit smaller. Since our collision object is 16 by 16, I'm going to come to resources, and I'm going to start to drag my, let's specify our collisions land is where we want to draw this. I'm going to start to drag and drop my collision object into my level to set up and define the collisions for the player. Okay, so we've placed all of our collisions everywhere. The only ones I have left to place are the ladder, and I just wanted to point these out that these are going to be on the outside because we are going to restrict the player's movement to be just inside of the ladder. And for our intents and purposes and our perspective, this chunk of water right here is going to be a, quote unquote solid. And we're going to do the same for this bridge over here. So we've successfully laid out all of our collisions for our normal land. And if I go ahead and hit play, we should be able to move around and collide with the environment correctly, and everything's gonna look just fine. All right, so you'll see that we can walk around, we can collide with the walls just fine. But when we come down here, we're still walking on the water, we're colliding with the bridge, even though we aren't on the bridge, we're underneath the bridge, supposedly. So now we need to start setting up multiple layers so we can achieve this visual effect. So the first thing I think is the easiest to do is to come in and create a new layer, and we need to define it as collisions water. So this is where the whole, what I call this video, the collision layers, comes from, is because we're essentially creating two layers with two separate sets of collisions, and we're going to toggle between which one is active and which one is inactive, and then that way the player will just only interact with whatever collision layer is currently active. So in order to achieve this, we've already defined our land collisions. Let's go ahead and define our water collisions so we know where the player can and cannot move when they're on the water layer. So I'm going to do the same thing. I created a new layer called collisions water. I'm going to come in here and I'm going to drag and drop my collision pieces into a place that makes sense for water collisions. All right, so we've successfully placed all of our collision boxes everywhere on our water layer. And now if we look, we can see that we've not defined any sort of collisions here on this water space right here. So the player would theoretically be able to come right through here and move right through here without any issues whatsoever, but they'll still collide with these walls. And this is essentially what we want to happen when the player is swimming around. So we have both of these collision layers on, but if we just hit play right now, the player is in a collision object, so it's not going to move anywhere, but it would just start colliding with everything. So what we need to do is we need to find a way to turn on one layer and turn off the other layer whenever we want to. So let's go ahead and do that right now. So inside of our OBJ game object, we're going to open it up, and we're going to create a new variable, and we're going to call it global.collision layer. And this is going to be keeping track of the current layer that is active in our game. In order to do this, we're going to create an enum called layer, and these are going to keep track of the two options, land or water. So we're going to just specify on create which one is active, and we're going to say layer.land, and this is the current collision layer that we want to be active. Now, what we can do is we can now look at this variable, and we can update this variable whenever we want to, and then update our collision layers based off of the state of this variable. So let's go ahead and create a new script that is going to do this for us. So we're going to create a script. We're going to come in here and we're going to say update collision layers. Okay, so now this script is going to do, all of the toggling between the layers. So how do we do that? Well, the first function that we need to know in order to understand this concept is a built-in GameMaker function called instance activate layer and instance deactivate layer. Both of these scripts are built into GameMaker, and they're going to be the core of this whole project. So what we can do is we can pass in a layer ID or a layer string name, and this is going to be the layer that is activated or deactivated. So if we were to come in here and say collisions land and collisions water, now whenever we call this update collision layers script, we would just turn off collisions water and turn on collisions land. So let's test that out. So in our game events, step event, I'm just going to put in a debug. I'm just going to say if keyboard check pressed, and I'm just going to tie this to P because that's been my go-to debug key so far. And I'm just going to say update collision layers. All right, so both of the layers are currently active. If I hit P, we can see that we deactivate the water collisions layer and we activate the land collisions layer. So now we're getting a little bit closer. If I keep hitting P, it doesn't really do anything. So it looks like it only just turns off that one layer once, but we can update our script to react to that global collision layer variable that we just created, this one right here. We can update our script to react to this variable and to toggle between them depending on which one this is. So if we come into our update collision script here, all we have to do is we can just say if global.collision layer is equal to layer.land, So that means the land layer is currently active. That means we want to turn off the land layer. So we're going to say deactivate, and we want to activate the water layer. Else, if global.collision layer equal to layer.water, this means the water layer is currently active, then we want to do the opposite. We want to activate the land layer, and we want to deactivate the collision's water layer. So let's go ahead and hit play, and we press P, and we press P again, and now what's going on? We just have this one layer and we can't toggle again, and what's going on? Well, we need to also update our collision layer when we call this. So we're going to say on update collision layers, we also want to change which collision layer is currently active. So in this section right here, if global collision layer equals layer.land, well, we want to set the new layer. We say global.collision layer is now going to be equal to layer.water, and then we update the layers. So let's go ahead and pop this in here as well. So now we're updating the variable when we toggle, and we are toggling the different layers. So now we should be able to toggle indefinitely between the two. So if I press P, so both of them start active, which we should obviously fix. But we can see here that if I press P, I can toggle between the two collision layers whenever I want. So I can walk down here, I can come into the water, I can press P, and now I have the water collision set up. Now you'll notice a couple things. Number one, we have to manually trigger this with a keyboard press, and we have depth issues where the player is not going underneath the ladder. So how do we fix this issue? Well, the easiest thing that we can do, and this is the approach we're going to take, is just create a new layer for the player and put that player on that new layer, which is going to be underneath these tiles. Now, the reason this is the easiest is because this bridge piece right here is tiles, and they aren't objects. So it's really kind of hard to work with the depth sorting of layer tiles and objects together. So it's easier just for us to create a new layer, move our player to that layer, and then just toggle between those two whenever we need to. So let's first start off the game by saying update collision layers. And this is going to only set one set of collision layers to be true at the beginning of the game. And I'm going to set this equal to water, because what's going to happen is it's going to look at its water. It's going to deactivate the water. It's going to set the current layer to land. It's going to deactivate the water, and it's going to activate the land. So by setting it to water, we actually are saying set it to land to begin with. Kind of a sloppy solution, but we can always optimize this later and make it a little bit neater. But let's move on to the more important part, which is setting up the depth sorting properly. So I'm going to go ahead and open up my room, and this is where we have to start creating some new layers like I mentioned earlier. So let's go ahead and actually rename this instances layer, and let's rename this to instances land. And now we're going to create a new layer, and we're going to rename it to instances water. And these are obviously going to represent the current instances on the current layers. Now, all we have to do is just drag this instances layer in between the tiles land and tiles water. And now whatever instances are on this instances water layer are going to be in between these two tiles, and whatever instances are on the instances land layer are going to be above all of the tiles. So all we have to do is, when we update the layers, is move the player in between these two layers as well, and it will automatically do our depth sorting for us. Okay, so we actually need to create one more object before we get into the actual transitioning of the player from one layer to another. And this object, we're just gonna call obj transition. And this object is going to be the object that is the trigger from one layer to the other. So whenever the player touches this object, it's going to automatically transition everything that we need. So let's go ahead and give this just a sprite, and we're going to come into the room, and inside of collisions water and land, let's go ahead and turn off one, and let's just work on the land. I'm going to drag this obj transition object into the room, and I can specify where I want the transitions to happen. So obviously we want these transitions to happen on the staircase here, and we want the transition to happen in the dock here. So I'm going to go ahead and drag these around just to specify that whenever the player touches these points, we are transitioning from land into water. Now, if we go back and turn off the land and turn on the water, move to the water layer, now we can start to specify the same thing for the opposite direction. So where do we want to transition from the water back into the land? And that's going to be these points right here. So now we've specified our transition objects. What we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and create a new state for our player, and we're going to call it player state transition. All right, perfect. And in our player state transition, and we're going to, before we make that, we're going to open up obj player, and in our step event, we're going to say if place meeting of x, y, obj transition, we're going to say state equals to player state transition. All right, so now we're saying whenever the player touches a transition object, let's move into our transition state. And this is going to be pretty straightforward state machine logic. If you aren't familiar with it, check out state machine videos and learn how to do that before moving forward. Otherwise, this might be a little confusing. Again, we are working off of a base level framework project, so we are not covering everything necessary in this video. So GameMaker offers a great built-in function for us that allows us to move an instance from one layer to the other. And this is very simply layer add instance. Now I don't love the name of this because this implies that it's adding a new instance or adding another one or creating some sort of object onto the layer, but this is simply moving an object from one layer to the other. So all we have to do is here, if we look at our parameters down at the bottom, we need layer ID, we need instance. So our layer ID is going to be instances water, and we're going to pass in ourself as our ID. Now, we want to move to the water only if we're on the land state, and we want to move to the land state only if we're on the water. So first we need to check if global.collision layer equals layer.land. Then we're going to move to the water state, and we're going to say else if global.collision layer equals layer.water, let's move to the land state. So now we're going to move our object from one layer to the other when we touch the transition object. And not only that, whenever we touch the transition object, instead of pressing P to toggle between our water and land collisions, we're just going to call update collision layers. So now if we hit F5 and we run our game, we should see that when we touch our transition objects, let's actually turn them back on just for the sake of clarity so we can see everything that is happening. All right, so when we walk down here, we're going to come down, we're going to touch our object, and oh, what is happening? Okay, so we're quickly transitioning between the two layers instantaneously, and the game is freaking out, and you can see this because our layers are starting to flicker. So how do we prevent this from happening? Well, the first thing we want to do is this is a pretty hacky solution, and I recommend that you find a way to try to improve on this if you can. But we want to make sure that the player has moved through the transition object all of the way before the layers start to transition. So we're going to just set up a quick little chunk of code that's going to do this for us. So I'm going to say switch facing. I'm going to get the direction that our player is facing, and I'm going to say if facing.left. We want to just lock our X movement position into a left movement. If facing dot right, we want to lock our X movement into a right facing movement, and we're going to repeat this for our other directions. Y minus equal 1. Now this is very specific to this project. Depending on how you implement this feature, might be a little bit different in your game. But basically we're saying when we're in our state transition state, we need to just keep moving, and then if not place meeting x, y, obj transition, now we want to do all of this code that we just created. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this project again. So I move down here, and all right, so we aren't ever moving out of this state. So I'm just gonna have my player transition itself out of this state. Now again, this is stuff that I've pre-specified for this project, but I'm just gonna say state equals player state swim. state equals player state move. Okay, so now we will transition out of this state. We don't get locked in here forever. Let's run this one more time. All right, so now what we do is whenever we touch one of these green transition blocks, our character gets locked into that movement it's already facing, and then once it's no longer touching that transition block, all of the code that we wrote triggers automatically. So now we can move between these layers just fine without any issues. And as you can see, our layer add instance is working properly because our player is now getting added to the layer that is underneath the bridge tiles. So that's pretty much everything for this video. Now there are some bugs with this code. Like for example, if you walk right here, you get locked in this movement forever all the way through the end, and it's pretty buggy and not great. But as I mentioned, this is just kind of an example to show off how you can use this feature. I recommend finding a ways, the very simple fix for this, and we're not going to do it in this video, but if you are curious, the very simple fix for this would, instead of using a if not place meeting condition here, we set up some sort of fixed timer. You can only move through a transition object for, 10 frames. At that point, you are out of the transition object. We trigger everything, and it's a fixed timer. You don't have to worry about weird collisions with these types of objects. Now, like I said, this project was a little convoluted and a little might have been confusing at times because I was using a pre-existing project, but hopefully the concept itself came across pretty clear that by using just a couple functions, this layer add instance and this instance activate layer and instance deactivate layer, we get a lot of customization of where we move our objects, how they're interacting with the world, and all of this happens instantaneously, so we don't have to worry about any sort of loads. And all of this happens instantaneously, so we get to see these effects happen in real time. It creates a nice visual illusion, and it gives that perception of 3D. Now you can take this concept and blow it up into 20 layers. I mean, that would be chaotic, but you could totally do it. It's totally possible, and it allows you to add that extra layer of depth to your two-dimensional game to give it that three-dimensional feeling and three-dimensional layers. So that's pretty much it for this video. If you found it helpful, please let me know. I would love to see how you implement this idea into your own project. As I showed in the beginning, I showed this example and I showed the airplane example, two different types of games, one a top-down RPG action style RPG, the other one a side-scrolling physics-based platformer. Both of them use this concept to create different effects by just toggling which collisions are currently active, and then by having the code for your entities interacting with collisions, they will do all of the automatic collision detection automatically for you. You just have to say, hey, these collisions are active, these collisions are inactive. So thank you so much, guys, for sticking through this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please smash that like button, smash that subscribe button, leave me a comment, let me know what you think, and I will see you in the next tutorial.